What is up, guys? CaptainWET here with another video guide on Dark and Darker. Today we're going to be covering the Rogue, the class I've spent the most time with and I'm most success with. We're going to cover things from the perks and skills, the weapons you can use, builds, what team comps you fall into, what gear you're going to be looking for, and then just some bonus tips for PvP and PvE. If you have any additional questions, feel free to drop by my Twitch stream and ask any along the way. And if you liked the video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. But here we go. One of the most important parts of every class is the skills. The skills will define how you play, more so than anything else. Caltrops is an alright skill with a really bad setback. It does damage to enemies who step in the trap you set behind yourself, however you yourself can walk into it as well as teammates, which isn't too big of a deal, but it does lower movement speed for 50% for 3 seconds. The biggest issue with this is that it only has 4 uses per raid, and you do not get those uses back. Cutthroat is one of the strongest skills the Rogue has in their arsenal. It lasts for 3 seconds, silencing all enemies' abilities. This includes all casting of spells and skills. It makes it they can't do anything if they are a spellcaster for that period of time. It only has an 18-second cooldown, giving you effectively 15-second downtime between the activation and when you actually get it back again. And this is more than enough time to take out any kind of spellcaster if you can get onto them, with the exception of sometimes a plated-up cleric. Cutthroat can be activated with a distance with a crossbow or throwing knife, and it lasts for 3 seconds, so it gives you more than enough time to gap close. It'll also shut down any channeled spells or spells in the middle of being cast if you hit them before they actually release it. Hide allows the user to become invisible for 8 seconds. During this amount of time, no one can see you, and you can change equipment in this state and no one would notice. It lasts for 8 seconds, however, it does take the same penalties as any other buff, and with Rogue having negative will as base, they have negative buff duration, so Hide really only lasts for around 6 seconds by default kit. Some people might opt out of taking it for this, or would take other perks to make it last longer. It is also necessary to activate Ambush, a perk we'll get to later on in the guide. Rupture is a damage over time ability scaling off of physical damage. Its base is 20, however, with the negative strength bonus Rogue defaultly has being under 15 strength, it will actually do slightly less. However, it will scale as you get to higher strength and physical damage. Do keep in mind, though, as a damage over time ability, it only scales 50% of the actual stats you put into it, so every 2 damage you gain will actually add 1 damage to Rupture. Smoke Pod is an incredibly useful ability that suffers the exact same issues that Caltrop does. It creates a large area that smoke is deployed in that makes it hard to see and also slows the movement of all enemies while not affecting allies at all. The issue is that it only gets 3 uses per dungeon and does not reset in any way. Tumbling is more of a gimmick than an actual useful ability at the current state it's in. It basically makes you roll backwards a little bit, however most of the time the Rogue moves faster than Tumble actually moves you back. This is more fun and for joke builds, but doesn't actually have a great place in the current meta. Weak Point Attack is an ability that makes it so that you and all allies that hit the same target as you for the next 3 seconds can ignore 30% of the enemy's armor rating. This is incredibly useful when you're suffering in fights where you're fighting a heavily armored enemy that your dagger doesn't really punch through quite as well with low damage given it has. But it works really, really well in team comps where you have, say, a ranger or someone who's able to hit the enemy with you, or other rogues. Later on in the guide, we will cover more specific use cases for each of these skills and what perks work well with them when we get to the build section. As you level up, you'll begin to unlock more perks for your character, totaling out at 4 at level 15. Once you have all of your perks together, you can start to compromise some builds and find what synergizes well together with the skills you've chosen and the weapons you've selected. Jokester gives you and all nearby allies +2 to all attributes, which is incredibly useful and more so for some classes such as Druid. The only issue with Jokester is that the range of it is very short. Also do note that this buff does not stack if multiple rogues in the party have it, so it doesn't really make much sense for everyone to run it if you're playing multiple rogues. Ambush can only be activated off of the Hide ability. If you're not running the skill Hide, it doesn't make sense to ever run Ambush. After your Hide drops, whether you drop it yourself or if you get attacked and it pops on its own, or time runs out on it, you will get a movement speed bonus of 10% or 30 movement speed over the course of 3 seconds, and also your next additional attack for that 3 seconds will deal 50% increased damage. This is an incredibly powerful ability and can be used whether you actually try to hide or not. If you just activate Hide while sprinting, it will still trip the ability. Back attack increases your physical power bonus by 30% whenever hitting a target in the back. This is incredibly useful in solo dungeons, as you can often creep or hide to get enemies with back attacks. However, the usefulness lowers as you get more party members involved. That makes it harder to actually sneak attack someone. It works on PvP and PvE both, however it's less likely to be useful in PvE as not a lot of enemies will put their back to you. However, there is still some use case. This is also useful when you're chasing someone down, hitting them with crossbows or throwing knives, as they'll usually be running with their back facing you. Creep makes it so you no longer make any audio cues while crouching, which is even better than slow walking as you move a little bit faster. It makes it so that you can sneak up on enemies, especially in solo play, as you don't have other teammates to worry about, but it works with pack of rogues as well if you're playing multiple rogues in one party. If you're all running creep, no one will ever know you're coming up on them. It could be used in group play as well if you're just using your team properly and making sure they don't know that you're there. Dagger Mastery, in my opinion, is the strongest perk in all of the rogues' arsenal at the moment. Daggers do more damage than the other options they have, and just increasing it further with 15% bonus you get from Dagger Mastery, it should be in almost every build you do. If for some reason you're trying out a non-dagger build, then it wouldn't be worth it, but you should almost always be running a dagger on rogue right now. Double jump is a tricky perk. It is very, very useful. However, the movement speed penalty it offers is so high that it's almost never warranted. If you're trying to just run around and treasure loot, then there might be some case for it, but I would never recommend bringing it for a serious fight at the moment, as AT movement speed is a huge penalty. If you're in a very end game build and you have such movement speed that maybe it isn't a hindrance, it might be possible, but this is a rare case. Hide Mastery triples the duration of your hide skill. It does not make any sense to take this perk if you're not running the hide skill, same as Ambush. It can be very useful if you're trying to be a landmine and let people walk into you to get that most effective damage burst out of Ambush as well. However, you do have to opt out of taking another damage skill in order to take it, so it may not be worth it. Pickpocket has one use and one use alone, and that is if you're trying to perform a pickpocket build based entirely around the skill. It makes it so that you're able to rifle through the pockets of your enemies and grab a little bit of treasure out of their bags. It won't let you take any gear off their person, but it can let you take things such as potions and arrows right out of the enemy's use, and in some cases make a ranger have no ability to fight back. However, the cost effectiveness and the risk you involve using the skill, it generally isn't worth doing with any kind of gear, so it's more of a meme build that people do for fun. It is definitely fun to mess around with, though. Stealth is a perk reliant entirely on you having the skill Hide. If you do not have Hide, it doesn't have a purpose. It makes it so that you can take a couple of extra steps while you're hidden without revealing yourself, and it makes so you have a little burst of speed while doing so. If you plan on moving around at all with Hide on, instead of just being an invisible landmine, you do need to take this perk. Thrust is another skill that only applies when running Dagger. It makes so you always have 20% armor penetration at all times with Dagger. Paired with Thrust, even people have incredibly high physical damage reduction. You can kind of completely ignore it and shred right through. I would recommend the skill very often when running Daggers. It's not always essential, but it'll help a lot when dealing with the plated up enemies, and that is kind of the current meta. Traps and Locks is a very valuable skill early on. It'll allow you to learn how lockpicks work and make it so that even if you fail, there's no consequences. Though I would, after you get a little more practice and skill with it, drop this perk eventually, as you can buy lockpicks just as everyone else can and use them the same way. And that way you always have an additional perk that you could use for damage or other survivability purposes. Though if you're just doing a loot run, it's always worth taking and saving you the gold of those lockpicks. Poison Weapon does damage over time like Rupture. However, Poison Weapon scales with magic damage. Things like Will, True Magical Damage, and Additional Magical Damage will increase how much damage you do with Poison Weapon at a half-point scaling, just like Rupture. I wouldn't recommend running Poison Weapon unless you're fully building into it using a lot of magic damage stuff, or if you are specifically just trying to get as much damage as you can with no other perks. Though there are much better physical damage perks you can build into instead of building around Poison Weapon unless you're specifically running it. Something to note about Poison Weapon is it will actually do less damage than it states unless you have 15 will, because you have negative magical damage bonus before that. At this time, there's currently 7 different weapons that the rogue can use. The 4 daggers, Castellan, Stiletto, Chris, and Rondell, as well as the rapier, the short sword, and the hand crossbow. There's been extensive testing done. You could check down below for a link to the Dark and Darker Rogues Guild, where they've done some stats there. You could check these charts as well, where they've kind of did DPS calculations to find what the best weapon is, though it does seem that daggers in all cases, even without perks, seem to be better than the rapier and the short sword. However, it's always nice to have a rapier for some PvE situations where you could poke things. The best technical DPS is going to be the stiletto. The Rondell is also a close second, and also both featuring armor pen now would be your best options. However, this is in a sandbox where all of them are created equal. If you have a high rolled dagger that has better stats, it could be worth using. A typical setup I would have would be a stiletto in one hand with a rapier and hand crossbow in the other. That is almost always what I take. But if I do find another better dagger I can use, that could be an option as well. Something to keep in mind is that there is a movement speed penalty for every weapon equipped, including daggers, and if you wear one in each hand, you will take both movement speed penalties. And the only modifiers that you'll actually gain from them are the enhancement rolls that you get, the random rolls. The actual damage on the weapon does not add to the other weapon, with the exception being the stiletto and the rondelle that now have armor pen defaultly built in. So I would only ever run 2 daggers if you have really, really well rolled ones, and specifically a stiletto and rondelle combo. There's many different ways to play rogue, and in this guide we're going to go over 3 primary builds as well as 1 additional meme build. And each of these can be changed. The perks don't have to be exactly how I use them, but I'm going to go over how I prefer to play them. Each of the different play styles are a little different, and the gear you might run might be slightly different, so I'll talk about each of them as we get there. So the first build we'll be going over is a dagger creep build. This is one of my favorite ways to play rogue. I would recommend almost always, if you have a dagger, both to have dagger mastery and thrust. Thrust isn't necessarily required, but it is one of the perks that you're going to want to field whenever you can when you're running daggers. 20 armor penetration is quite huge, especially when dealing with fighters and plate. Your other 2 perks are kind of optional. However, I choose to run creep. A lot of people will also opt to use hide instead, and then with hide you can take ambush and things like stealth and hide mastery. But I prefer to use creep. If you use the shadows to your advantage, you can get away with a lot. It does have a little bit more of a skill curve to learning it, and it works really well when you have a teammate who can draw enemies past you if you hide in a corner for bait. But it is not necessarily the only option. Back attack is also my preference. By using creep, I try to always engage. I open all of the fights with back attacks. I try not to take a fight that I can't sneak up on an enemy with unless I already know they are injured or if I poke them down with a crossbow. As for your skills, Rupture can be swapped out with a weak point attack. I think these are equal options, though I do think Cutthroat is one of the strongest perks in the Rogue's arsenal at the current state of the game. Like I said, if you wanted to run Stealth and Hide, we'll go over that, or Ambush with Hide. That'll be the next build we talk about, so I'm going to cut those out of the options for this. The only options I would recommend with this current setup is Cutthroat with either Rupture or Weak Point. I wouldn't really opt for any other abilities in this setup. When running Creep and hiding in the shadows, I recommend always taking potions off your belt. It's kind of a habit to always have anyway, but it makes it much harder to spot. When running Creep, your idea of going for PvP is to stalk around and look for opponents. Look for signs that they've been there, dead monsters, open doors, and anytime you have any sign of a player nearby, you want to just crouch down so you make no noise, and try to see if you can find an angle to attack them from without giving away your own position. Big rooms are your weakness. You usually want to stick to close corridors and places where you know you could sneak up behind them without being attacked by a ranger or another ranged class from afar. But ultimately, you will see in this clip here that I fight a ranger who hits me with multi-shot for a good amount of my health. I do end up winning the fight overall, but if I had hit him with Cutthroat with either a throwing knife or with my hand crossbow beforehand, it would have saved me a lot of health, as his multi-shot does a good amount of damage to me here. It does work on non-casters. Any kind of skills such as sprint from a fighter or things like the multi-shot from the ranger are also silenced. They can use any skills whatsoever, so it's something to keep in mind whenever you're in a fight. If you're ever in a position where the enemy is below you and you don't want them to hear you drop down from somewhere because Creep does not cover falling, I would always wait for an opportunity where there's some kind of audio to muffle up your noises and continue sneaking on. Usually people are oblivious to it so long as there's some kind of other auditory distraction, such as the rock fall or the elevator in the goblin cave. Once you've confirmed that the enemy is something like a wizard, you know if you get them with the Cutthroat, there's no way they can fight back whatsoever. You just sneak in and wait for the opportunity to hit them. Once you hit a wizard with a Cutthroat, there's basically nothing they can do for the next 3 seconds. So if it's in melee range, they're basically dead to rights there. Overall, one of the most important things about Rogue is to know your limits. Rogues die very, very quickly. If you lose your advantage or upper hand, or you make a mistake like I do in the following clip, your best tool is to run away. Reset, come back and fight later, avoid the fight altogether afterwards. Fighting plated enemies such as this can be very difficult, so you can kite and do things like ranged attacks, but that's what ends up costing me a lot of damage here when I accidentally pull out a campfire. Once you get away though, you close doors faster than just about anyone else, and you move faster than most classes. Put away your dagger, run, drink some potions, heal back, and then you can come back into the fight later if you think you can. Always know when you need to break out of a fight though. And while this is my favorite way to play Rogue, one thing that you'll hear a lot when you hear from the Rogue community is the word Landmine, which will be the second build we'll touch up on, which is using Hide to your advantage to play stealth instead of creeping around. The second build that we're going to go over is the hide ambush build. This is a very powerful build. It used to be kind of the only way people would play rogue, being the titular landmine rogue, but it is a little less valid now after they've nerfed hide a little bit, though still very powerful. You synergize hide, which makes you invisible for around 6 seconds, with the abilities of ambush, which once you leave ambush, you get a 10% movement speed bonus for 3 seconds, and your next hit will be 50% bonus damage. If you get a headshot with your next attack, someone unsuspecting bumps into you and you landmine attack them, the damage is pretty catastrophic. Usually this is synergized with both dagger mastery and thrust. You want to capitalize on the most amount of damage you can coming out of ambush. And then the last perk is somewhat optional. I usually prefer to run stealth with this so that if people don't walk directly into me, I can still make it to them. However, you could swap this with hide mastery if you want to make it so that people have a longer window for people to run into you, or something like jokester or creep or even back attack. All of them are valid options, though I do think stealth is probably one of the strongest. Your second skill, it could kind of flex between cutthroat, weak point attack, and rupture. I think all of them are valid options. I prefer cutthroat. If someone steps into me like a fighter, it'll make it so they can't use second wind, which makes them actually killable. This could be pretty useful to get out of a lot of situations where you might landmine into the character that you don't want to landmine into. And it's also a very useful perk if you end up getting a skirmish with like a mage from a distance, and you could silence their spells and close the gap a little better. Another really strong synergy between hide and ambush is to not even use hide to stealth. You can literally just use hide to go invisible to proc ambush. You could do it while full sprinting. It will make you invisible for a split second, and then you'll get that burst of movement speed as well as the next damage burst on that hit. So you could use it to run away even, or to close a gap of an enemy who might be a little far away from you. While running hide, your ultimate goal is to have the enemy walk into you, but sometimes that won't be the option, and you might have to sneak up to them. Rely on slow walking and crouching to sneak up on them and use hide to the best of your advantage still. Sometimes it would be more advantageous to rather set up in a position they might walk into in the future rather than directly approaching them. However, in this clip, I'm going to sneak directly up on this guy. Depending on what you're up against, you can opt to not use hide and save it to retreat in case things go wrong, or use it to send all your damage immediately. I choose to use hide here because I see it's a fighter who might have a lot of health. I also use silence to prevent him from healing.
Mission failed. We'll get him next time.
This build still works, I promise. I just don't do it a lot, so I don't have tons of good clips for it anymore. The third build we're going to go over is going to be a poisoned weapon build. The build is going to centralize around having poison weapon, and then we're going to run rupture with it to be damage over time and entirely. You could combine this with a variety of other things, such as weak point attack, cutthroat, or hide, and build it kind of into the build 1 and 2 we talked about already. The main difference with this loadout is going to be you're going to have slightly more versatility. Things like jokester are going to have a lot more value, as you'll get will for it as well. The goal of having poison weapon is going to be to get to 15 willpower with your gear, and then getting things such as additional magic damage and true magic damage on rolls. I usually only run poison weapon when I have like a kind of kit that I've slowly accrued over time all built around this. I also would still prefer and recommend you run dagger with this, using dagger mastery. Thrust is a little less important as you're going to be doing a lot more magic damage. However, if you have a really good rapier or a really good short sword and you really want to use it, you could opt out of running dagger mastery and running something such as jokester. Usually the burst on this is a little less reliant. You're going to use crossbows and throwing knives to give it a little more damage over time into the build. So the burst of hide is a little bit less effective. Usually I try to kite around. I tend to prefer to run creep in this build setup, along with jokester to get the extra stats and will. And then field whatever you want for the last one, though for me it'd usually be dagger mastery unless I have, like, again, a really good short sword or something, and then I may run into hide with ambush instead. I'm not going to show any footage for this because it's going to play pretty much the same as the other builds, except for you want to try to pull out of the fight and let people kind of take damage over time and just keep hitting them with things like crossbows and with throwing knives. Though the main focus of the build, you're going to want to have the additional magic damage. You want 15 will. Going over 15 will is not super important. You want to just kind of get to 15 will. Anything over is kind of waste unless you get a ton of will, and it's still not really worth it. But movement speed is going to be huge in this build. You want to zoom as fast as you can so that you can continuously kite enemies and just slowly take damage over time on them. And the final build we're going to go over is more of a bit of a meme build. It's fun to use. It's not super useful. It's literally to avoid combat in entirety and be a pacifist. The Pickpocket build. When I run Pickpocket, I always run Hide as well as Smoke Pot. And I try to avoid doing fights as much as possible. With Pickpocket, you're always going to want to run Stealth and Hide Mastery. This way you can follow around enemies a little bit and you last a lot longer in invisibility to pickpocket as much as you can. Your final perk, I prefer to run Creep, so I could just kind of mix these all together and sneak up on enemies and loot as much stuff as I can off of them. You could also opt for traps and locks, but I try to avoid fighting even the monsters in the dungeons as much as I can with this. So I don't really get access to a lot of chests other than ones that players left behind because they're locked still. You could take Jokester to get a bit more movement speed or even Ambush to try to run away from enemies. But again, I like to use Creep and just kind of try not to get noticed whatsoever. Running away isn't really the plan. So whenever I run Pickpocket, I always take off all clothing that has movement speed penalties, so no shirts or pants. I'll take a dagger in case I have to fight PvE, but I usually try to avoid it altogether. The Shadow Mask has no movement speed penalty and gives you some agility to make you run a little bit faster and dexterity to interact quicker. I'll take Utility Gloves for higher interaction speed and Lightfoot Boots to move as fast as I can. You can hang on to starting meds in case you need them, things like that. One thing I would recommend, though, if you are trying to specifically pickpocket geared players, you do have to make sure your gear score is over 25. You'll see less new players who won't really get much gear on them anyway if you're under 25 lobbies. So if you're trying to specifically target pickpocketing more skilled players, you're going to want to put on maybe some agility rings or an agility pendant, things with movement speed on them, but you don't really want to take shirt and pants. If you have a higher tier, maybe a green pair of loose trousers, that could be an option as well to try to get a little bit more movement speed out of it. But it's not required by any means, and you would want to go over 25 gear score if you could help it if you're trying to loot players. Another small tip, I know it's daunting to go into multiplayer lobbies solo, but you will usually have a higher success rate pickpocketing teams than you would a solo player. Teams tend to be more oblivious to footsteps and things being dead in the area because they have teammates who are also doing those interactions. So it's much easier to catch a whole team off guard, and then usually easier to get away from them as well in the chaos. When using Creep, you can move into positions where enemies won't expect you. When they don't hear anything, it usually is a good sign for them that no one's there. If you manage to get inside of a room with the enemies and tuck into a corner, often they'll never see it coming, and sometimes even while you're not invisible, they don't even notice you there. So long as they already scouted the room and expect it to be empty, they're not looking anymore. Sometimes you won't be able to get off a ton of pickpockets, but just getting a couple off is always better than none. And right here you could see the barbarian doesn't even realize that I'm just sitting here right next to him looting stuff. Later on, that same exact team, I caught outside of that room, got into a fight with another team, and this is one of the best times to pickpocket. If you clean up at the end of a fight, often people are standing still looting bodies. They expect after they killed 3 players, everything is safe. You could always just wait around for the fight to end, but it's also an option to try to get into a position where you might be able to pickpocket during a fight. I try to catch the fighter here, but I don't find the opportunity, so I wait for Hyde to come back and I chill out for a minute. But as I see the fight starting to wind down, I'd go to try to find a position where there might be a body nearby that people would be expected to loot. It is always dangerous to loot someone who is in the middle of looting something else as they have their inventory open, but again, right after a fight, most times people aren't super suspicious and aren't paying too much attention. Just stick to the shadows and do your thing. As I hear the fighter approach, I stop and make myself invisible, and go ahead and get some loots off. I don't get too picky on who I'm hitting, I just grab what I can. When one person moves out of position, I'll move for the other one. And even here, I let my invisibility completely wear out. Once Hyde ends, I just keep going for it. As he seems oblivious already, he's staring at an inventory screen. He's not any the wiser. People don't suspect anything after a fight, and it's usually a really great time to go for some loot. I do get a little over greedy here, but that's why you always have Smoke Pot for the getaway. Something to keep in mind is always to know your route out. Because unfortunately, without killing monsters and with no gear on, you might get yourself caught in a bad position when being chased. Here I knew the extract was open already though, and I figured it was a safe place to go. And sure enough, they couldn't stop me. Rogue can be a little tricky to play in a team. Most importantly, because they have to play selfishly. They can't try to save their teammates and be the hero because it's just not really what they're meant for. Rogues go in and out of a fight, and then they usually have to reset, and that's just how it is. So the most optimal teammate if you're going to play on a team with Rogue is, of course, other Rogues. Duos and even trios with Rogues works really well, but there is many other ways you could utilize a team. My main duo is actually a Cleric who just tries to bait enemies into fighting him while I sneak up behind them. The thing is, if you're playing with a team that is not other Rogues, they have to understand that you are a Rogue and play around you being a Rogue. I find that my most effective teammates are usually ones who are a little tankier, things like a plated up Cleric or a Fighter. That way they can survive a little longer if I take a little longer to get in position to get an attack off on an enemy. And also if it's other Rogues, they usually can just bail out of the fight if they need to. I find harder comps to play together with are things like Rangers, who struggle to peel enemies off them and only have range as an advantage, as Rogue benefits a lot from having other teammates causing distractions up close. Bard and Warlock are both kind of variable depending on how they're playing and how you're playing. Bard specifically, though, if you're playing Hide, works much better than if you're playing Creep. If you're trying to sneak around in the shadows, it doesn't work very well when you have the Bard buffs on you at all times. So I don't recommend this one unless you're playing Hide Ambush. But the Warlock, if they're going to play safer and stick back, it can sometimes work, so long as they're going to be able to peel for themselves using Hydras. One of the most common questions I get when streaming the game playing Rogue is, what gear do I get? What gear do I want? What stats do I want on my gear? So we're going to cover, first of all, the most important stats for playing Rogue. True physical damage, additional weapon damage, movement speed, bonus movement speed. These are all incredible things to have. If you can't get hit by attacks because of how fast you're moving, that's the goal. True physical damage and additional weapon damage scale really well and ignore armor. If you can't get any of those, the next thing you want to get is additional health and physical damage bonus. These things will increase your damage, but not quite as much as the true physical and additional damage will. Next, you would want things like health and action speed and armor penetration, and then the raw stats of like strength, vigor, dexterity, and agility. It's hard to say exactly the perfect balance of these, but you want to make sure you have enough health to take a hit or two. I usually aim for at least 130, 140 health in like a very good kit, but you're going to want to at least try to aim for 120 in a low kit in greens if you're actually buying gear. The value of each of the stats can kind of vary. You don't want to pick up, say, a 1 vigor modifier over top of taking a 3 strength modifier. However, vigor is a very valuable stat on Rogue. The magical damage only really matters if you're playing poison weapon. If you're not playing poison weapon, I wouldn't worry about getting any magic rolls whatsoever. The priority is going to be 15 will, and then after 15 will, you also want to get additional magical damage or true magical damage. The other magic rolls aren't super valuable. After you get these things like resistance, both physical and magical, are useful. Resourcefulness will increase how fast you open doors, interaction speed as well. If you're running Hide, buff duration could be useful. But these are all stats that you would prefer over top of anything that I haven't mentioned here. These aren't really goal stats. These are just, if you have to get the stat, it's filler, it's useful, but not completely wasted. There's various stats that are pretty much wasted on Rogue. Things like knowledge doesn't really have much value. Magical interaction speed will help you open portals and get shrines quicker, but it's not really valuable at all. So anything like magic penetration, these are all kind of wasted perks in entirety. When it comes to gear weapons, I've already kind of went over, but I prefer the stiletto. I feel like it's the strongest dagger by a large margin. However, the other ones are all still optional. I wouldn't really run a short sword or rapier unless you have like a really well rolled one with maybe some magic rolls to do the poison build. When it comes to necklaces, frost amulets are going to be your best option with some health on them. If you can't get that, then a necklace of peace with some additional or true magical damage would be an option you could take as well. Rings, realistically, you're going to want to get strength or dexterity. You could also go for agility or vigor, but they're a little less valuable. When it comes to bodies, I think the real main options are the doublet and the wanderers. You could opt for a marauders, but I wouldn't wear a marauders until it's at least purple or epic rarity, so that it counteracts some of its own movement speed penalty with the agility bonus it provides. Boots, there's lots of options you could run, but realistically, I think I recommend only Lightfoots. If you really can't get a decent pair of Lightfoots with some movement speed, you could do Adventurer's boots. It's not really my preference, but you could if you wanted to. The same I'd say with gloves is you kind of always want riveted gloves. You really don't want to be running around with other gloves. You could get the Vigor gloves if you really can't get a good pair of riveted gloves, but riveted is all I really run personally. When it comes to headgears, I would always prefer to run the Shadow Mask. It has no movement speed penalty whatsoever and offers the biggest raw stats. The trade-off being that it doesn't give any headshot damage reduction. You want to try to be optimal, not ever like try to crouch and hit people low. You always want to jump and try not to get hit in the head ever when you're running this. You could run a Rogue's Cowl if you have a really well-rolled one, but I don't tend to run it. As far as pants, loose trousers are the zoomy pants. You go super fast with these things. They give you agility and have almost no penalty. Once they're green, they already counteract the penalty they give with the stats they provide. Cloth trousers can be used as well. They will make it so you swing a lot faster with your weapons. It could be very useful for DPS. The penalty and movement's not bad at all either. When it comes to cloaks, I think the stats that they roll, something like having the +1 additional or true physical damage is really important. The cloak itself is more to round out your stats. You could go for an agility one, a dexterity one, a strength one, or a vigor one. I think these are primarily the ones you want to wear. You really shouldn't go for a will one or a knowledge one. But I personally try to usually get as much vigor as I can into my kit and juice up my health a little bit so I can take a hit or two extra. So that would be my personal preference if I have options. All of these are just kind of guidelines as well. If you find a piece of gear that isn't the like perfect piece of gear for the rogue, but it has really, really well-rolled stats, it may be worth running still. Look at what the rest of your kit is. If you have maybe something that gives you a little bit more movement speed penalty, you find a really, really well-rolled piece of heavy legs, but you have a good kit otherwise from that has plenty of movement speed and you're still over, say, 310 movement, it might be worth running. You have to just kind of look around your overall kit and optimize based on that. When it comes to fighting PvE in the game, rogues struggle in many ways. They have a very, very short-range weapon. They have no form of blocking, and if they get hit, they usually have 0 headshot reduction and low armor and health to begin with, making it very hard to take hits. As a rogue, I recommend bringing lots of bandages and potions early on, and never overcommit. And if you don't know how to fight a monster, watch its attacks, bait the attacks out, and step back. Only go in for one stab at a time if you need to. Take your time fighting. It doesn't have to be rushed, and you don't always have to go for backstabs or optimal damage. Don't be afraid to use your abilities like Rupture to speed up a kill if you need to. And again, just take one attack at a time if you need to at first. It can be really hard getting used to getting into dagger range and getting back out of attack range. Don't forget to always turn sideways when strafing back instead of backpedaling as you move much slower. Abuse your movement speed. That is the value of a rogue. When learning how to fight bosses on rogue, using the dagger can be quite daunting, getting in and out of melee distance with a lot of attacks that are very difficult and very punishing. It could be worthwhile trying to play around with the rapier or hand crossbow more and just watch the boss and learn the attacks that way. However, if you want to go in for the dagger attack, it's always worth having poison weapon if you're just specifically bossing. If you're getting in loads of little attacks, and then the fights take a long duration, you get a lot of damage in over time from the poison, even if you're not speccing into the additional magic damage. It adds up and stacks so long as you're consistently hitting. You could use things like crossbow bolts in between whenever you have to back off from an attack just to keep the poison ticks going and managing to get as much damage in as you can. Most bosses don't have a ton of armor to begin with, so weak point attack is less valuable than Rupture, but you could bring it if you wanted to, and if you're just trying to maximize your DPS, you could run both, theoretically. Hide often isn't worth it, especially if you're the last man standing in a boss fight. If you hide in the middle of a boss, it will reset the boss in most cases. So it's not worth bringing for sheer damage unless you're really confident your team will stay alive in the fight. PvP can be incredibly difficult to learn on rogue at first. Your weapon's smaller than almost everyone else's weapon. You don't really learn a lot from sneaking up on someone, stabbing them 3 times in the back of the head, and killing them. So you will even learn at a slower rate even when you're succeeding in combat. Judging the distance of attacks and trying to bait them and try to weave in attacks in between their combos can be very valuable on slower attacking weapons, but something to learn and keep in mind is the actual attack patterns of the enemy weapons. Using things like walls to bait out an enemy's attack and have it collide with the wall can give you a big opening to attack. This is especially true with bigger weapons such as war mauls and battle axes that will obliterate the rogue in one shot to begin with. Some of the hardest matchups could be fighters with things like arming swords and falchions, as they have relatively smooth attack patterns that are tight and can be hard to bounce off walls. Don't forget to always retreat if you need to. Rogue's movement speed is better than almost anyone else's. Even fighters sometimes with sprint can't keep up. While kiting, turning and throwing your throwing knives or using a hand crossbow can get some good damage in, but don't overcommit if they're right on your tail and you really need to break out of the fight. Always knowing an exit route is important too. Leaving doors open is pretty common on rogue because of how fast you can close the door. and how quickly you can get through them. You just keep your ears peeled and listen out for enemies who might be sneaking up behind you as well. But if you have a pattern of doors you can close behind you, you can often break distance on anyone chasing you and get a full reset, losing them in the process. And that's all there is to it. If you found the video helpful, don't hesitate to like and subscribe down below. And if you want to ask any additional questions on Twitch or have any concerns with the guide or think something might need to be edited in it, feel free to let me know. I'm live most nights around 8 p.m. Eastern, so you could stop by there as well. Appreciate you watching the video to the end, and have a great day.